Welcome, everyone. I see as most of you are filtering in, we're excited to have you here today. Thank you so much for joining us for this Garrison Institute Forum event. This is part of the Garrison Institute Forum, a series of conversations that we're hosting with leaders across the domains of planetary health, education, and social justice. Before we begin today's session, we'll go over a few logistical items. We're on a Zoom webinar, so participant audio and video are turned off. We'll reserve time for questions, so please post your questions in the Q&A panel, which is accessible at the bottom of the screen by hovering your arrow over the Q&A button. We're on for an hour today, and we'll respond to as many questions as we can. Please forgive us if we're unable to get to your question. Today, our guests are Dr. Dan Siegel and Dr. Mark Greenberg. Dr. Siegel is an internationally acclaimed author, award-winning educator, a renowned child psychiatrist. He is clinical professor of psychiatry at the School of Medicine at UCLA, where he serves as co-director of the Mindful Awareness Research Center. He's also the executive director of the Mindsight Institute, an educational center devoted to promoting insight, compassion, and empathy in individuals, families, institutions, and communities. Dr. Siegel also sits on the Garrison Institute's Board of Trustees. Mark Greenberg, Ph.D., is the emeritus holder of the Bennett Endowed Chair in Prevention Research in Penn State's College of Health and Human Development. He retired in 2019. He's the founding director of Edna Bennett Pierce Prevention Research Center. He's one of the primary authors of the PATHS curriculum and has conducted research on its impact since 1981. He is the author of more than 300 journal articles and book chapters on well-being and the effects of prevention efforts on children and families. He's one of the founders on CASEL, and you can find more information on www.casel.org, CASEL.org. A recording of this conversation will be made available on the Garrison Institute website. And now let me hand things over to Mark.
Thank you, Amy. It's great to be with you all today. Dan and I are going to have a conversation that is spontaneous, and I'm excited to join Dan to talk about attachment and awareness in times of stress. The Garrison Institute offers these sessions free of charge as a goodwill gesture to support the community during times of heightened uncertainty, but donations of any amount are very welcomed. Now, I want to talk about something special today, which is today is the international shutdown for researchers, both in the US and around the world, regarding our own potential contributions to systemic and structural racism. There's an opening now and a time of change in which issues of diversity and inclusion and deeper understanding of systemic and structural racism is sweeping through our communities. And as teachers and as parents, the awareness is critically important to support children and communities and to create the communities we want to create. So I just want to mention today, I think it's critical for all of us to look at ourselves, our own unconscious biases, our conscious and maybe unconscious acts that have implicitly or explicitly supported systemic or structural racism. And for us to more deeply understand how each of us can face these issues with forthrightness, but also with kindness. As James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed that isn't faced. So we need to speak up. We need to teach ourselves and each other, our children, how to identify and engage and dismantle racism and oppression within ourselves and those around us. And that's really central to the development of awareness. In fact, there'll be another webinar specifically on this topic sponsored by Garrison next Tuesday, June 16th, on racial justice and the Dharma, led by Ali and Atman Smith and Andreas Gonzalez from the Holistic Life Foundation. So Dan, let's get started. I think maybe we could start by talking a little bit about our interpersonal neurobiology and how it relates to our awareness.
Well, thanks, Mark. First of all, thank you for being here. It's great to do this with you. I think this is our first time sort of doing a spontaneous joint presentation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's really exciting to do this. And thank you, Amy, for the introduction, and to the Garrison Institute. And it's a wonderful thing to support, in this case, the educational wing of our initiatives there. And as Amy mentioned, we have planetary health and also social justice issues that we work on, in addition to doing compassion-based resilience training. So it's an honor to be here, and I'll start with your question, Mark, about interpersonal neurobiology, and just say that when you and I first met, I believe it was at the Garrison Institute in the turn of the century, and that was almost 20 years ago. And I remember being so impressed with how rooted you are, and you've been a leader in making sure that the educational interventions that we explore and then support in schools has research backing, that it actually works, that it does good, not harm, and that its effects are long lasting. And so I just want to honor you for, a lifetime of your professional work, really leading the way in all sorts of really visionary leadership of having us think deeply about what is a child, how does a child grow in the school system, how can we understand things we do in schools to promote more than just the first 3 R's of reading, writing, arithmetic, and all the wonderful ways you've done that. So I want to really honor that and say that in the parallel pursuits I've had, it's from a very different approach, but it's building on science to really think deeply about what the mind is, and then how a developing mind can be understood to be changing across the lifespan. And I think if we look at all the different sciences, like, for example, anthropology that studies culture, sociology that studies groups, linguistics that studies how we speak to each other with language, psychology, which studies wonderful things like attention, you're asking about attention and awareness, or emotions and intelligence, things like that, or biology, that studies living things, including the study of genetics and neuroscience, and then chemistry, and even areas like physics and mathematics. And in the field I work in, interpersonal neurobiology, we ask the simple question, what would it be like if you combined all those fields into one framework, one perspective? And so over the last few decades, what I've been trying to do is work with colleagues to look at this field. We call it interpersonal neurobiology, but it's different from social neuroscience in that we're not just a branch of neuroscience, which is a branch of biology. We actually take what E.O. Wilson would call a consilient approach to say, what are the common findings across that? So one of the things that we explore, for example, is the way, in fact, the human mind can be seen as not just a word we use, the mind, for brain activity. And so this might be fun, Mark, to play around with this one, because in our view, the mind is broader than the brain. It's fully embodied. And so in schools, for example, you'd want kids to be in touch with their bodily sensations, just as a simple implication of that. But then we say that the mind isn't just embodied. It's for sure not just in skull, but we say it's broader than the brain and bigger than the body, in that the relationships we have, say, with other people in attachment, and you and I share this history of being trained in attachment research, and we can talk about that, but the relationships that a baby has with their caregivers is foundational to how the mind develops. And we can then look at that child then getting into the school system, the educational system, the relationships with teachers, the relationships with peers, and then even how we relate to our larger society called culture, and then even how we relate to nature. So the relational aspect of mind for us in interpersonal neurobiology from a scientific point of view is as foundational to understanding the mind as brain science is. So this gets some brain scientists kind of agitated, and they'll say to me, chasing me down the hall, how can you possibly say the mind is not just the brain? We know it's just the brain. And I'll point out that the anger and irritation that's happening between us is a part of their mind and my mind. And how can they just say it's part of what goes on in the brain? So this is a deep, issue in all the different, the textbook, The Developing Mind, that I've written now in its 3rd edition, tries to take a really conservative stance actually about it, but then say, look, if you're an educator or a parent, the mind of the child you're trying to educate or help grow up is happening just as much between you and that child or adolescent and the child within herself or himself or their self. And this is something maybe we can pause, because if I think about the powerful work you do in CASEL, the Consortium for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, I think it's just an absolutely brilliant way where the emotional, which absolutely has to do with the whole body of the child, not just their thinking that might be in their cortex, especially the left cortex, but the whole body for emotional intelligence needs to be drawn upon. And for social intelligence, what CASEL is, the Consortium for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, even though I'm not a part of the CASEL directly, I think interpersonal neurobiology supports the CASEL stance, which is, in schools, we need to teach the mind of the child, which, and just to be clear, I'm not using that term to mean intellect. I mean anything that's relating to subjective experience or awareness or information processing that's, in cognitive science, we say it's fully embodied and enacted, and it's extended beyond the body, and it's embedded in our relationships, our culture. So, I'll just pause there and just say that from an IPNB, interpersonal neurobiology point of view, there's a scientific reason to say mind is this embodied and relational self-organizing process that's regulating energy and information flow. And teachers or parents can then work with the relational side of mind and the embodied side of mind, seeing it all about energy and information flow. And then we can talk about what a strong, resilient, healthy mind might be, and even relate that to issues of racism and social justice, and even environmental destruction and environmental justice, because there's a natural way where IPNB addresses those. And those are very important issues facing all of us in schools right now.
I can't agree with you more, Dan. Let's explore this a little bit more, because I think, most of us are focused on the issue of self-regulation. How do we regulate ourselves? But our ability to self-regulate evolves out of the co-regulation of our early and continued relationships. And it begins with co-regulation. If anyone spends any time with a baby, you know that the baby is co-regulating you, but you're also leading and co-regulating the baby. And in fact, we have the most fun with our children, and with at any age. It doesn't matter if they're teenagers or 6-year-olds or 3-month-olds, when we follow their lead and we allow them to co-regulate us also. Because when we come into presence with them in a way that allows them to lead, they enjoy it so much more, and so do we. In fact, one of the best treatments for children that are often aggressive and disruptive in the home is to help parents just learn to be present with their kids and to learn how to let the children lead, which brings them into a sense of mutual trust.
Beautiful.
So,
yeah, well, and let's look into that presence, Mark, because that's so beautifully said. We're both trained in attachment work. And this is a fun thing that Mark and I know about each other. And the word attachment for science and for education means the relationship between, a child and a caregiver. In other contexts, in Buddhist practice, I've had some fun discussions where the word attachment means clinging to a previously established idea, and you shouldn't have attachments, because it means like being fixated. So let's be really clear. When Mark and I here are talking about attachment, we're not talking about being rigid and fixed in your thinking, like I'm attached to an idea. So attachment is love, and what's so interesting about, taking a broad view of, let's say, attachment in the larger context of education is you can say, well, what are the fundamentals of secure attachment? So Alan Strofe and I were just talking about this the other day, a person who's done the longest longitudinal study. It's now 45 years in the making of studying you know, families before a kid was born and now following them into their mid 40s, right? So we were chatting about this, and ultimately, when you say, well, the best predictor of a child's security of attachment, which is basically the best gift you can give to your kid, lots of other variables of their temperament and random things that happen also influence their development of mental health. But of the things you can make a difference in, it's secure attachment. So then you say, well, what is the best predictor of that? And it's presence. It's parental presence that we should really explore, because if you really look at the science of presence, then you can see where social emotional learning sort of emerge from teaching people to be present. And even in the care program that you are really, you know, waving the flag of in a beautiful way, that came from Garrison and Tish Jennings' original work, you know, that you can teach teachers to be present. And even if they don't change the educational curriculum directly, the kids still benefit from teachers learning to be present. And in parenting education, and the developing mind talks about the science of this, but in the application, you know, if you teach parents to make sense of how their own past affected them, then their own developmental history, they can actually be more present for their child, because the leftover garbage or unresolved issues, it isn't impeding their capacity to literally enter a state of awareness, let's just call it receptive awareness, where their child can send them signals, and instead of them being filtered through expectation and judgment, there's curiosity, openness, acceptance, and love, this COLE acronym that I use to remind myself what presence has as its components. Curiosity about what the kid is bringing, not judgment. Openness, rather than being pushing away what they're saying, like, I'm really mad, I'm really mad. No, you're not mad. No, that wouldn't be being present. Just being present for their anger, right? Curiosity, openness, acceptance means what is. My child is angry right now. So I'm curious about it. I'm open to it being what it is. And now I accept it. I don't just resent it. I learn to really accept it. And acceptance isn't passivity. And then that gives rise to love, where you can just be there with your child's anger, let's say, about the pandemic or whatever is going on.
That's right. And, you know, I was one of the last students of Mary Ainsworth and knew John Bowlby. And the way she talked about this from the beginning of attachment theory is that what parents needed to be is responsive to baby signals and sensitive to what they were saying in their bodies and in their speech. And being insensitive and responsive is another way of talking about really being present. And when you're present, increases your ability to co-regulate behavior. And the same thing's true in school. I mean, it's very difficult in ways. Teachers have an intensely difficult and stressful job, having 25 or 30 kids in the classroom. And there are certain children that come with difficulties because maybe they haven't had secure attachments, or they don't feel that there's a reason to be attentive, or they don't have a sense of hope or optimism about what will go on in the classroom. But the teacher's ability to have presence with those children and to co-regulate them, to bring them into regulation, is something we can see happen. And we see that, for example, in work like the care curriculum, where teachers begin to develop a greater presence and learn a new way to listen to children. And that's really being, as Mary Ainsworth would say, sensitive and responsive to signals.
And Mark, can you say more about what you mean when you say co-regulate? How would a teacher or a parent listening to us now, how would they understand what that term means? We use that a lot in science and in clinical work, but how would a parent or teacher really get that? What would that mean?
Well, let's think about the opposite in a way, maybe. Parents who are really busy have children that often will feel neglected. Or I'll say it another way, they feel like they're not being seen. Being seen is another way of talking about this. And this often leads them to act out in some ways just to get attention. And it happened in my family. I'm sure it's happened in yours. It happens to all children sometimes. But one of the fundamental findings in my own work on the effects of insecure attachments is that children will do almost anything to get attention. And so when we freely give our attention and are present, that's a way we can talk about positive co-regulation. Whereas when parents are preoccupied with their own concerns, or they're reenacting inattentive or traumatic relationships they experienced in their childhood, as you're saying, without new awareness, Dan, then they have children who often will either avoid them or develop a sense of loneliness, or will do anything necessary, including acting out and hurting others, to get attention. So
Yeah.
parents who can, there's a concept from D.W. Winnicott called good enough parenting. No one is perfect. We don't want anyone to be perfect because we're not perfect in anything that we do. But parents who can devote their time as much as possible to enjoying and following the lead of their children. We all know this ourselves. We have more fun, the children enjoy it more, and they feel more valued and they feel closer to us.
Yeah.
And so the ability to do that is important. And in these days of the cyber world, I don't know if you know the new term phubbing. Phubbing is a new term. I don't think it's in Webster's dictionary yet, but scientists are studying, and that's parents being on their phone in the presence of their children or their partners.
Yeah. Well, you know, it reminds me of, you know, I didn't know the phubbing term, and I hope I didn't phub too much with my kids who are now young adults, but the translation of some of the attachment science builds on exactly what you're saying in this framework of just showing up. You know, Tina Payne Bryson, my former student, who's now my co-author in many parenting books, you know, what we say is, you know, there's no such thing as perfection. Instead of perfection, you want to aim for presence, right? So we have these 4 S's, just to say really briefly. The first is safety, and especially in times of the pandemic, this can really be a threat that many of us feel as parents, even if your kids are grown. You know, how do I keep my kids safe? So the first thing as mammals for 200 million years of our attachment system is to provide safety for our young, right? So the other part of safety, though, is that sometimes if we get really distressed or agitated, or, you know, we can do things, yelling, screaming, or even sometimes doing things directly to a kid, you know, hitting them and stuff, that can be terrifying. And so the second part of the safety is that there may be times when we create a state of terror in a child, which can lead to basically a biological paradox, because part of their brain says, I'm in a state of terror, I should go to my attachment figure to be protected. But another part of their brain says, I'm in a state of terror, I should get away from the source of terror.
Right.
So if you as an attachment figure, whether you're a teacher or a parent, are the source of terror, then your child can have a fragmentation of their mind called dissociation, which goes along with a form of attachment called disorganized attachment. And unfortunately, we just had a meeting at UC Berkeley with a bunch of disorganized attachment researchers. And in our meeting, we had a week together. It was very organized, actually. Sadly, it's a really huge thing if there isn't a repair made by the adults who are in a position of authority, who can lead to this terrifying state. Peter Fonagy, a researcher, has an incredible term that I find really appealing, but also distressing, which is epistemic trust. So epistemology is the study of how we come to know what we know. In philosophy, ontology is how something becomes what it becomes. So epistemic trust is where someone in authority, like a parent or a teacher, is presenting you a view of reality that is actually false. Mm-hmm. This could be extended, let's say, to someone who runs a company or a country, for example. And if what they're presenting is a violation of epistemic trust, it can lead to this deep feeling of agitation and lack of trust, not just in the person speaking, but in a sense of safety in the world. So for the first S of the 4 S's, we can just briefly touch on safety now with the pandemic and all the political things going on and the social unrest and seeing someone murdered in front of an entire planet and seeing the lack of compassion in the person conducting that murder, I think has created an earth-shattering sense of a violation of epistemic trust and a violation of justice, that when we just look at the first S of these S's, our sense of safety begins with our parents and other caregivers. So we have alloparenting, we have others than just the mother or the father. So the caregivers now are in a position of creating safety for us. And we extend that into companies and countries. And we want to see our leaders be protectors, right? So there's a lot you could say about that, but just to point out that the emotions we feel, the social connections we feel, the fabric of our culture is based on how leadership demonstrates these S's, the importance of safety, right? So epistemic trust is just a part of that. The second S is just what you're saying, seen, you know, and you said it so beautifully, Mark, when you're present as a parent, you see your child for who she is, who they are, who he is. And in that being seen, one patient of mine said this so beautifully, they feel felt.
Mm-hmm.
You feel a part of a we. And I couldn't say it better than she did. I wish I know her name, but I'm not allowed to say her name because she was my patient when I was a trainee. But that phrase, feeling felt, is what we mean when we say you feel seen. And of course, accepted and all the stuff that presence allows. The third S is just being soothed. And this is where the co-regulation comes in for emotional distress. If I'm in a state of distress, my caregiver then connects with me in such a fashion that we become part of a we, and then my feeling isolated and distressed can be reduced and I feel better. That's the soothing. And the fourth S, if you have those in a reliable way and when they don't happen, it's repaired. That repair is so important. Ed Tronick beautifully demonstrates that we're often disconnecting, maybe not phubbing, but we're often disconnecting in various ways. So repair, 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 repair. There's no such thing as perfect parenting. And if you identify a time when you haven't kept safety there, you haven't seen your kid, you haven't soothed them, make a repair so you get the fourth S, which is security of attachment.
Right. So Dan, I might just mention that we'd like to take questions during our conversation. And so
Yeah.
I encourage people to write in their questions. You know, the same is true for teachers and therapists and principals, all kinds of people in caring professions. To the extent that we're present with people, we develop mutual trust and caring. And when we know that someone is truly listening deeply to us, it naturally just makes us feel closer, feel supported, feel cared for. So one of the key aspects of being a true teacher or a caring parent is the ability to listen, especially when it's hard. And so we can think about social emotional skills that will teach children around recognizing their emotions and resolving conflict and learning how to negotiate and get along with others, how to use an ethical framework, including now, I think, social and racial justice as issues. But in addition, we've been thinking a lot about principals of schools because principals create this culture of the school. And as you're saying, the culture of the leadership can either lead to a sense of anxiety and grief or loss, or to a sense of true welcoming. And we need to think about not just the teacher in the classroom we found, but the leadership of the principal and their ability to become what we call a pro-social leader of a building, where their job is not primarily to manage or do instruction. Their primary job is to make sure that everyone that walks into that building, children, teachers, other staff, and parents, feel that they're seen and they're respected and cared for.
Yeah, beautiful.
But we haven't taught, this is not part of what we teach principals to do. And so we've got a lot of work to do to create the kind of new culture that we really want if we want to have the kinds of democratic communities that we're seeking.
Absolutely. And, you know, Mark, what you're saying reminds me of the Michael Rudder 10,000 hour study, exactly where the headmaster of a school in London was switched from one school to the other. And, you know, basically the ways the kids did was so related to what one individual created in the culture, just like you're saying. And we have a principle in interpersonal neurobiology that has a simple word, integration, which means honoring differences and promoting linkages. And so from our point of view, the idea that a leader of a school, a principal or a headmaster, can create such a ripple effect throughout the culture can be understood from Rudder's study as when the principle is integrative, when they honor differences of different opinions and brought them together with compassionate linkages, you know, this is what created well-being. And when there's an impairment to integration, it leads to chaos or rigidity. And, you know, there's a 500-page book I wrote about that, just that one idea. But to just say this, that there's a lot of science behind the notion that integration is the basis of health, whether that's in the individual child, or a relationship and attachment, or a classroom, or a school, or a company, or a country, or even the planet. And you can just look at all these systems, and that gives us a useful way of going. And we have a bunch of questions here, Mark. Well, two questions that are coming in. One is from Slovenia.
Yeah, should we
Yeah,
look at?
why don't we get it? You want to read it or shall I
I'll
read
read
it?
it. Sure, I'll read it.
Great.
We plan to enter our son, who's going to be 6 years old, was just 6 years old, to grade 1 of elementary school in September. He's quite separation sensible, but now he is prepared to enter school. I think separation may be a little wary. Is it better to postpone entering school for 1 year? There's a lot of risk from lockdowns. Next year, maybe everything will be more normal, hopefully a vaccine. What is here from an attachments point of view?
Wow. Great question, Micha. Really great question. Any thoughts about that, Mark? And I have some thoughts.
I think that I probably would want to get to know the school a bit. I'd probably want to, I just talked about principals. I'd probably want to speak to the principal about the school. I'd probably want my son in this case to have an individual meeting with the teacher probably before school starts if possible, if I was concerned, because developing that one-on-one relationship is really critical. And you talked about co-regulation earlier, Dan, and a good example in the care curriculum is one of the homeworks that teachers do in the care professional development is they do an interview with a child in their class, maybe they're not getting along with or they just don't know well. And the point of the interview is just to listen. It's practicing mindful listening. And what teachers find is that they don't really spend that much time one-on-one with children to actually get to know them. And if they can just take the time, take 10 minutes, 15 minutes to really listen to a child, to hear their view of the world, what games they like to play, what computer programs they use, who are their brothers and sisters, and how do they have fun? Children, when they feel listened to, as I said before, naturally start to come into regulation with a teacher, begin to feel cared for. And I think that just that initial ability to have a relationship with the teacher they're going to have before they enter a classroom with 25 children they don't know, I think could go a long way to help this process.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Mark. And I would just build on those points of view that, Miha's asking the follow-up to the question about, what happens to the relationship when teachers are wearing a mask, for example. And Mark, your point is, that this student, whether it's your son, Miha, or anybody we're considering, will go from the attachment relationship at home to then the classroom. And I feel so honored to be with Mark because Mark, of anyone on the planet, has worked so hard to understand what is that classroom like really for the child's development. I'll just say from a point of view, I'm a child psychiatrist. So I see kids, in the office who are telling me about their experience in school. And of course, I've, attended schools, sent my kids to school, and I've actually been an observer in schools, but haven't spent the time that Mark has actually in the classroom and studying the classroom. But what I'll say from a developmental point of view is exactly like you're asking, and it's building what Mark is saying, that if you look, and Luann is asking about the 4 S's, if you look at, are kids going to feel safe in the classroom? So with the pandemic and the fear of the virus, that's an issue. In the United States, we have a lot of shootings. Those are issues. How with the racial injustice going on, kids feeling that the whole society is unsafe. With the murders that are going on of people of color, but also with the protests of peaceful protesters being assailed by government officials, this creates a feeling of unsafety. So the first of those S is safety. A teacher is going to be needing ready for him or her or they to, realize this child now out of the home and in the classroom is going to still have these attachment needs for the first S of safety. And then what Mark, you're saying so beautifully is, when we are there and present as a parent or a teacher, the child has the experience of being seen. And your question, Micha, about, well, what happens when the nonverbal communication that includes facial expressions is now only through the eyes because of the mask? And that's a really great question. I don't think we have any research on, what happens when your parent is wearing a mask or, that's a great question. And it's the co-regulation that Mark is introducing us to that depends a lot on nonverbal signals and what you could call the attunement or the alignment of nonverbal signals. So if Mark and I were in real time, not on this Zoom context, and I were to smile, and then I thought about something, I started to get really sad, and Mark were to miss that and just keep on smiling, and he didn't catch my sadness, and if there wasn't a shift in his facial expressions, when mine shifted, I would feel we're not really close and connected. So I wouldn't feel seen, right? And then the soothe part, this third S, wouldn't happen. So I wouldn't have security in this relationship at that moment anyway. And if the teacher were too busy and didn't realize there was a misconnection, there wouldn't be a repair. So these S's, you know, safety, seen, soothe, secure, happen in a classroom. And it's a great question. What do you think, Mark? How is wearing masks going to affect the whole thing?
Well, I think it's complicated. And, you know, I just read an article about schools that opened up in the Netherlands, and they were elementary schools with younger children. And the teachers had planned to wear their masks. And they had long discussions about what would happen when a child fell and hurt themselves on the playground. But when the children came, they took off their masks. And when children got hurt, they hugged and cuddled them. So
Wow.
I'm not saying that's necessarily what should happen, but I think that's what naturally is probably likely to happen over time. And I think, you know, it's important that we keep people that are positive out of schools, and that we're doing enough testing and temperature taking, et cetera, that this can happen. Now, that's not to say that teachers shouldn't wear a mask, and probably some can carry it off, I think, and still build the relationships. But I think it does make it more complicated.
And maybe it's good to name the 7 nonverbal signals, so that if you're a teacher listening to this, or a parent, although at home you wouldn't have to wear a mask with your kids, but let's just name them. So, you know, you can remember these by doing it with me as we do it, the embodied thing. Eye contact is one, so masks won't block that. Facial expression, which especially is the eyes to the chin, all this stuff, you have all these muscles actually built into the skin, which is very unusual. So we can put an incredible amount of facial variation, but when you're wearing a mask, you wouldn't be able to see it, right? So facial expression is number 2, that would be blocked. Number 3, so you have eye contact, facial expression, and then you do your posture, and that a kid will see, even with facial expressions being blocked with a mask. Gestures they'll be able to see, even if you're wearing gloves, right? And then the tone of voice, we shouldn't forget that they'll be able to hear. And the timing and intensity, so you point to your wristwatch and then you make fists for intensity, timing, intensity, response. Those 7 nonverbal signals are worth memorizing. The mask only blocks the face. So 1 of 7 nonverbal signals gets blocked. So if you can highlight the other 6, you know, I think we might be able to get around it. It's not ideal, but because the face is very, very important. There's no question about that. But there's a way of then making sure that nonverbal is highlighted in all these things. Eye contact, maybe not facial expression, but tone of voice, posture, gesture, timing, intensity of response. And if you just memorize those and realize, you know, and I know people aren't supposed to talk like this, but if you look at the science, it's true. The right hemisphere of the brain, even though neuroscientists are saying, no, the 2 hemispheres are the same, they're not the same. Just look at the science.
That's right.
Although the scientists are saying they're the same, they're not the same. And nonverbal signals are primarily sent by and received by the right side of your brain, whereas language for most of us is in the left dominant mode, linguistic language. So we need to make sure we're communicating with much more than just the linguistic strings of words we have.
Dan, you know, we've been very worried about what's going to happen when children return to school, but also what happens when teachers return, because it's not only children that have been traumatized by not just COVID, but as you're saying, by the events of vicious violence that we all have seen and experienced and are trying to process. At CREATE, we are developing a 1-day training, which we're going to train the trainers around the world, which is called Rebuilding Community. And the idea behind this training is for schools to take a day, not just about procedures, but really to take a day about what's happened to us and how have we coped and what do we want our school building to look like? How are we going to welcome children in a way, knowing that both we and they have been really traumatized. Many children are very anxious right now for good reason. And so I think schools being intentional about how they return, not just in terms of the procedures and the masks and the PPE, but thinking about what we want to be as a community. This is a time for us to really rethink what are schools about. And what we notice is, I think what we notice is that when we're not physically in school, we miss is relationships. And relationships, as we're saying, is how we're regulated. We don't just regulate ourselves. We're regulated by the nature of the love and caring that's given to us by others. One of the really profound things that I think we all experienced during COVID is the notion of our interdependence, how interdependent we are. I think for a lot of us, it's given us a greater appreciation of others. We often spend very long time on phone calls that used to be 2 minutes with our family, and now they're 2 hours because we can't see them anymore.
Yeah.
And I think that there's also a sense of resilience, that we've learned that people are resilient. This is not the end. We can deal with uncertainty without catastrophizing. And what we need to do is cultivate our capacity to tap into this deeper self that we have, what our true caring goals are for ourselves and others. And while that's hard to do when emotions run high and people are feeling quite anxious, it's exactly the time to really develop this awareness, to really talk frankly and forthrightly about what have schools been like and what they should be like in the future.
Yeah, that's beautiful, Mark. And the CREATE program that you created, along with your PATHS program, I really want to urge people to check in with Mark's work, because whether you're focusing on what principals do or what teachers do or what parents can do, having this deeper kind of learning is so important. When we draw on the science, and I see there are a few more questions we can touch on, part of the hopefulness that I think Mark's referring to has to do with this question from Taryn, can you move from, an avoidant dismissive attachment style to a more secure style? And the answer is yes. I wrote a book called Mindsight, where you'll see a person in his 90s who did exactly that. And it talks to you about how you can facilitate that happening, Taryn. So just take a look at the story of Stuart, because he changed so much. His wife of over 60 years, called me up and said, "Did you give Stuart a brain transplant?" Because in fact, the brain is open to grow throughout the lifespan. So middle age is nothing. Stuart would say, if I can do it as a 90-year-old, you can do it too. And, in terms of Lindsay, your question about the negative consequences of rupture, Ed Tronick with his colleague just wrote a book called The Power of Discord. And the idea there is, you do want to make sure to repair things as soon as you can. But I'm just going to put in a plug that it's never too late. I was taking care of a person in her 30s, and she came to realize there were some very painful things that happened in her childhood. Her parents in their 60s had the courage to come in. They were from out of town. We did this long session where we did adult attachment interviews, and all three of them together. And that the AI is a part of the attachment research world, but that's what I'm trained to do. And the pain of unresolved trauma and unresolved loss that was never spoken about, even by the parents to themselves, that then could be shared with their daughter, was so beautiful that these parents had the courage. And then the repair that happened decades later changed the whole dynamic of the culture of the family. So yes, you want to do it sooner rather than later. You don't want to wait, 20 years, 30 years. You want to do it sooner, but I would say it's never too late. So that's the idea, that repair is so important. And Ed's book, The Power of Discord, Ed Tronick can do that. And if you haven't seen the still face experiment, I would make sure you look at that. It really gives you an emotional experience. And then the anonymous attendee is asking us, how does social media platforms and technology impede messages of optimism founded on secure attachment? Yeah, I mean, this is, we need to use those platforms. We have a community called it started as the personal experience of the planetary pandemic. Now it's the personal exploration of planetary possibility, where we're having people think about just this question in a community that's called the MWE community, me plus we equals MWE, and I urge you to come join us there, because we're addressing this exact kind of question. How do we deal with violence, sexism, hatred, and all the ways where you can see them from interpersonal neurobiology point of view as a blockage of integration. So it's a blockage of health. So the science of environmental justice, the science of social justice would embrace exactly what Mark, you were saying about the interdependence, the interconnectivity, really in some ways, the ways we ignore how interdependent we are, interconnected we do to our peril. It's an impairment to integration, and acknowledging the reality of interconnection is the first step in us moving to a different way of living after this disruption of the pandemic and the incredible shift that's happening because of the social injustice that's been there for decades and maybe even centuries, not maybe, and for centuries it's been there. So how do we now not go back to business as usual and go to a new way to live as a society on this planet?
Mm-hmm. Dan, there's a question that maybe we could answer that Carrie raises. That she says the reality is that we will most likely continue to have some sort of remote learning this fall. And that's probably likely some places and not others. What are your thoughts about cultivating this deep integration via distance learning? And then Miha, who we responded to our earlier question, says maybe it's good for children to see the outside teacher without a mask first. And I think we can answer those questions together in a way, because in fact, that's one way that that Miha, your son, could meet his teacher, which is to first do it through distance learning, where he would see her face, could even see her house and her dog and her cat and her children, and really begin to become comfortable and have a one-on-one experience. Now, I don't know how much of this deeper integration we can do via distance learning. It takes a very skilled person to be able to do this. And unfortunately, most teachers just have never been trained how to be skilled at distance learning. And we're all catching up at the same time, and it's not so easy to do. But for the same reason, I would suggest that if we're going to get a deeper integration with distance learning, it's going to require these one-on-one relationships. And the more that teachers can reach out now and spend just a little bit of time with each child and with their parents if possible, they can begin to develop these kinds of relationships that then can work together in smaller groups in a distance learning context.
Yeah, and just to support that, it reminds me of the study done by Patricia Kuehl and Andy Meltzoff at University of Washington, who I know you know them, you're up there in Washington, but you know, studying the baby Einstein tapes and seeing that language is learned through relationships, not just by stimulation from a video. So we want to be humble about, you know, what we can do with just videos themselves. And as Mark, you're saying, just it supports that notion that relationships drive learning, right? And when you think about what we started with, that the mind is as much relational as it is embodied, you can understand the power of relationships to then be the foundation for learning.
Right.
Let's see, we have another one here about, let's see, we're going to be involved in some sort of distance learning. Oh, that's what you're saying, yeah, there.
Let's ask one, Dan, do you have curriculum recommendations for social emotional resiliency work with young students with disabilities? Well, first of all, you can go on the CASEL website, casel.org, and look at the guide that CASEL has created. It's like a consumer reports for social emotional learning programs. The program that I am one of the co-developers of, the PATHS curriculum, actually we began in sign language with profoundly deaf children. In fact, our first randomized trials were only with children that were profoundly deaf. And over time, that curriculum has been used with children with children on the autistic spectrum, children with developmental disabilities of different kinds. And what it really takes is a teacher who is well trained and is flexible. And we've found that while we can provide a curriculum that is generally good for kids, consulting with a teacher about each child and their needs really is helpful to begin to personalize this more as needed for children with different kinds of needs.
Great. And Mark, if I can take Tessa's question to ask you a question to deepen it, and actually connects to the next two questions from Miha and Alyssa also. When you see in this question from Tessa, social emotional resiliency, for you as a person who's been a leader in this field, what does that really mean, resiliency? But also, as is used, not just by Tessa, but others, people do talk about social emotional intelligence. What is like, what is that really? What does it really mean to be social? What is, I know you and I have had chats about this. What are emotions? What is emotional? I mean, what is an emotion, period, let alone emotional regulation or emotional intelligence or emotional resiliency? When you think about those, having spent a lifetime of your professional work thinking about it, what does that really mean, this question from Tessa, you know, social emotional resiliency?
Well, I think it's a couple things. You can look at the Castle 5 components of social emotional learning, but I think fundamentally it gets to three things. One is it's the ability to know yourself, to begin to be able to monitor your internal states of being. And as you said, Dan, at the very beginning of this, it's not just the brain, it's the embodied mind. It's knowing how we feel. It's being able to assess from our gut and our heart and other places all around us, and our cues, how we're feeling, and of course, how other people are feeling. And the more that children can do that and put those into words, they get increasing power. And my original work, of course, as I said, was with profoundly deaf children. But there's great work on neuroscience, for example, by Matthew Lieberman at UCLA, putting feelings into words, where we know that as soon as people are able to label emotions, they begin to be able to regulate and control in a positive way. I don't mean control in a negative, but in a positive way. They're able to regulate how they feel and express it in ways that are more appropriate than acting out. So the first component is really the internal part. The second part, I think, is the interpersonal, and that is the ability to get along with others. And for kids, that's what matters. If you want to know what makes children resilient, it's having friends. And that means being able to manage the give and take of friendship, including rejection and how to handle that. All children come home at some point and tell you that they're no longer friends with their best friend. And the question of repair again, just like with attachments with parents, the ability to repair a relationship is really critical. So these interpersonal skills of communication and repair, being able to listen carefully to others is the second part. I think the third part is just using your thinking skills well to resolve conflict. That is, using your cognitive empathy to think about the needs of others, to understand the larger situation, and to do it with a sense of strong ethical grounding. So in the PATHS curriculum, we talk about this as living the golden rule. Now, we could say, well, living the golden rule, we can just say the golden rule, do to others as we'd like them to do to us. But there are an enormous number of developmental skills, because as Oscar Wilde said, only the naive know themselves. That through our entire life, our whole life is really about the ability to be our best selves, if you want to think about it that way, be able to regulate ourselves in a way that we can create caring, loving relationships and create a community of people that are forthright and just and kind.
Yeah, beautiful.
The ethics part is important. And this is where the issues around racism, I think, especially come in, is that when we think about being forthright and kind and having an ethical field, I think we're all starting to think much more broadly about what it means to have an ethical field, both for ourselves and for our children, and what school should be like. What do we speak up about? What do we admit to, et cetera, that can help us to move forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's so beautiful. There's a term in interpersonal neurobiology we use called mindsight, which overlaps with notions of psychological mindedness or reflective function. Or Dan Goleman, has said, mindsight is kind of the mechanism beneath social emotional intelligence. But what the idea of mindsight is, if you take what Mark just said about recognizing what's going on, both within your body and within the inner subjective life of someone else. Both those would be the mind of the other. So we talk about empathy and compassion, or the mind of the person in the body you're born into, which we call which we call insight. So this insight and this empathy and compassion, when it's integrative, and integration means honoring differences and promoting linkages, when that integration is made visible, it's kindness and compassion. And what's fascinating about integration, it even is a guide for morality. So this last question that is on our list now from Adriana in Brazil, she says, the need for everybody to reframe their sense of significance and personal value is a great issue now. And this relates to what Mark was just saying, that, the COVID-19 pandemic with this SARS-2 virus that's going on, this new coronavirus, affecting all of humanity has raised this issue of like, what is essential, what really has meaning. And then Adriana goes on, the responsibility of leaders, governments, schools, and parents, all positions of authority that we've been talking about, we've been talking about epistemic trust, is essential in order to highlight pro-social values. And from an interpersonal neurobiology point of view, and I think this would be consistent with a social emotional learning of Castle point of view, pro-social means integrative. Is your action going to promote honoring differences and promoting compassionate linkages? I don't know if that resonates with you, Mark. You know, so that's what for us pro-social comes from integration. So then you say, can you have integrative values? And they help address issues of morality as well. And in Brazil, where I live, the major issue is the lack of trust. So there's the epistemic trust right there. The lack of trust and lack of support. So that's the being safe, seen, and soothed. So you feel secure. That's what creates support by the government. And the government, in a way, when we get to be adults, the government are like our parents. It's the parental authority. We want to feel within the culture that the larger culture is our family. So this is a serious issue you're pointing out, Adriana, not just in Brazil. It's also in the United States. And all we can say, all I'll say is vote, vote. You know, but if that's being threatened in a country, that's a serious problem, obviously. I fear that this induces violence, and we've been seeing it here in the US, and in Brazil, we know that a lot is going on today, and search of an enemy to blame. And in fact, we should touch on that briefly. I know we're getting to the end of our time, but we should address this just in a moment about in-group, out-group stuff as a negative form to regain the sense of significance. Yeah, how can we shift that? So let me just say a brief bit and then open it up to Mark to respond to this question too. Adriana, your question is so profound. And I'll just say this, that this is very condensed. I did like a whole 90 minutes on this at the last PET meeting, and there's a recording. You can go there to hear the deeper view, but the short version is we have 50 million years of history in our primate evolution of in-group, out-group distinctions. Whether we're humans for 200,000 years or 4 million years, it doesn't matter. We've elaborated that in-group, out-group distinction with categories, concepts, and linguistic terms that create a mental construction where we embed within culture this notion of in-group, out-group, good versus bad. And especially, and this comes from a set of studies called terror management studies or mortality salient studies, when we're threatened, then what happens is your human primate brain intensifies in-group, out-group distinctions from evolution. And we know from studies of 14-month-olds that at that age, you already distinguish who's like me and who's not like me. So this then gets amplified in a culture of threat so that you find out whether it's by what we call race, which is a mental construction, but racism is real because we then say that's the out-group or the in-group, kill the out-group. And now we go to another set of brain studies that show that under threat, and even sometimes not under threat, who you see as the out-group, the circuitry of empathy, number one, of creating maps of the mind of another, seeing their subjectivity, their perspective, their respecting their agency. That's a SPA acronym, subjectivity, perspective, agency. For the self, you actually shut it off in your own brain so that the individual you're seeing in front of you, like that police officer with George Floyd, doesn't become a human being in front of you, becomes a piece of trash, an object. And your brain just sees them as, you know, just like a rock, tossing a rock in a lake. You don't think about the rock's experience. So sadly, 50 million years of history, you know, this other stuff, we are capable of dehumanizing others. And this is how we need to shift it. For us, we think we need to shift a deep understanding of who we are to realize we're both embodied and relational. And then together, we use this word we, say we can make a new way that humanity lives on Earth, in addition to realizing we are a part of this whole planet.
Thank you, Dan. I think we're coming to a closing, and just to add to that, I think, you know, voting is important behavior, and You know, in spiritual traditions in the past, we would often be told just to take care of yourself, work on yourself, and that would be sufficient. But spiritual traditions change as culture changes. And the idea of more radical dharmic action for social justice, I think, is really another aspect of this that we need to really explore. That is, we can't just let governments be what they are. We have to help to remake them, even if it's at a very, very local level, even if it's only in our neighborhood or our family. And so I think that we need to think about both ourselves, but we have to think about how we're embedded, as Dan and I have been saying all day, in a culture of co-regulation, and how we can begin to alter that process. And given that, I'll remind you that next Tuesday, there'll be another Garrison talk on Dharma and racial justice. And before I thank you all for joining us today, I'll also be moderating the Garrison Institute Forum, the next session on education, scheduled for July 14th at 4 o'clock. And I'll be having a conversation with Krista Turksma and Tish Jennings, two of the developers of the Cultivating Awareness and Resilience in Education, the CARE curriculum, that really has been hosted and developed in the context of the Garrison Institute and its belief in the importance of acting out in the world as a way to improve it. So please check garrisoninstitute.org for updated listings of future sessions and to view recordings of this webinar and others. I think we've gotten to most of the questions, Dan. I hope it's been fun for you. I've really enjoyed it, and I know we could have gone for much longer, and maybe we'll do it again sometime. Again, all these sessions are offered free of charge, and if you'd like to support this programming, consider making a donation. Dan, thank you again for being together with me. Really
Thank you, Mark. It's been an absolute pleasure, an absolute joy. Thank you so much.
May everyone be healthy and safe and do what they can to improve our lives for everyone. Thank you.